Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our lecture for week 3. So this lecture is focusing on our 2 forms of assessment. So we are looking at mainly observation, and then we're looking at on-entry and standardized assessments as well. So best starting point whenever we are thinking about early years is making sure that we consider how children learn, and the best thing to do is to observe them. So our plan, we are looking at assessment of, for and as learning. We're looking at the idea of how we be objective and confidential. What is good observational assessment, and what is some examples of assessment that is more standardized, that does include some observations and so on as well, but it's got a more standardized element to it. And we're looking at particularly on-entry assessment. So let's do a bit of a recap on what is assessment. So the purposes of assessment, we've got assessment for improved student learning and deep understanding. It requires it to be used with 3 overarching purposes. You would have heard these before. We have assessment for learning. That's where we're doing some diagnostic assessment. We're looking at what do they already know and how we can then inform our teaching and their learning. We're looking at assessment as learning, so it's where the kids are doing something and they might be going, oh yeah, I don't understand that. And so then they're changing it themselves. So we need to design those experiences for them. And then we have more of our summative style assessment where we're looking at what have they learnt. So this is where they use their evidence of what the children have already done, and we make some judgments about it. And it could be related to our achievement standards, our goals, our things that we're looking at for reports, and so on. So we want to think, how do we actually build those 3 elements into every teaching and learning program that we create for our students in some form? So when we're building those, the first thing we have to think about is, what are we going to do? But the first thing is, how are we going to gather those pieces of information? Now, one of the main ones that we use in our early years is observations. Now, observations, we can look at a child and go, oh yeah, they're fine. But we can really look at them and then have a reason for observing particular items and then go, oh, okay, they're not as fine as I thought. We need to look at this in more detail. So we want to collect a range of things. Now, those work samples don't always have to be pen and paper work samples. It can be things they create. It can be things that we are watching and we take some photos of. It can be things where we see what they are touching, how they are holding their pencil, and we take a little photo of it. So our work samples don't always have to be the pen and paper work samples that we would think of when we consider older students. We can interview and talk with the child. Just sit them down next to you, and a few questions, you will soon be able to work out whether they can understand what you're saying or not. Sometimes I've had children who I'm a little bit worried about their speech patterns, their cadence in their speech and so on. I just sit down and have a little conversation with them, but I'm really observing and listening for particular sounds, and I'm asking them particular questions that will require them to say those words that I'm worried about. And I'm like, they're really not able to put their tongue forward, or they're really having difficulty with their initial sounds, or they're missing all of their end sounds. So my interview can be focused on content, but it can also be focused on something like watching and listening for their sounds, looking at where their eyes are moving. Are they able to form particular hand motions when I'm asking them to collect something, and so on. So my interview gives me lots and lots of information. Then we have our standardized tests. Standardized tests are often seen as evil and so on. I really like standardized tests because it gives me validation for my concerns. So when you go with a range of data to a professional, some of that data can be your observations, it can be your work samples, it can be notes that you've written about different things. And then when you also take one or more standardized test results, it validates your observations. It's not the observations aren't valid in the first place, but it gives another layer when you want to talk to a professional about it, or even when you're starting to talk to parents. When you say your child is performing a year below expected in these areas, we're a little concerned. Or have you been to a pediatrician for an assessment, because this is what we've found out so far. It makes your information something that parents can hold on to. And you can go the other way, that your child might be performing well above expected. What would you like us to do? What are you already doing at home? And so on. So it works both ways when you want to have meetings. So how are you going to record it? So you need to think about, if you've got observational records, where are you putting them? How are you going to make sure that you can access them later on? Are you date stamping them all? So one of the things that I would do when I had year ones, I would have every child read to me at the very beginning of the year. We would read similar, like the text that we thought they were about ready for based on what we'd found out from pre-primary and so on. And I would have that as a record at the very first week or two. That would be just one of my observations that I would have. And I would put it all in my OneNote and I would have it all there. And then I would be able to have it date stamped already. It was then perfect because I would do that again in a month and then again. So I would try and do my reading at least twice a term. So that way I had some date stamped records about their oral reading abilities. And then I would have my anecdotal notes. Again, I would categorize my anecdotal notes. If you put them in a digital form, it means that you can search by word. So when you would use keywords, you can find them and so on. I would use checklists, huge amount. They were my most common one that I would do. And again, my checklists I would have in folders. And then once I transitioned into digital, I made sure that I was very careful in what I wrote on the top of my checklist so I could search for them. I would use rubrics for longer pieces of work, things that had taken a longer period of time to complete and so on. And I would use rating scales all the time for the way that I wanted them to look at certain things. So I would then have a rating scale against what they had done and so on. You always want to think about, what is your responsibility with all of this information? Who do you need to share it with, and at what point in time in the school year do you need to share it? And who can view it? Are you putting this on the shared drive on your computer? On your school's databases? Are you just keeping it on your own personal computer? Are you printing it and having it in the classroom? If you have it in the classroom, is it locked away somewhere? What is your professional responsibility and your accountability for this whole process? You need to make sure that you are keeping this information nice and secure, but that it's available for the people who need it. So when we are doing observations, we want to try and make sure that we're avoiding the categories and labels and avoiding those stereotypes. It's very easy to go, oh, that's just typical boy behaviour. Is it though? Why are we attributing that to a boy's behaviour? Is it something that we need to analyse out and go, no, it's not. I'm concerned about this because of this, and this is the behaviour and so on. We want to try and avoid stereotypes, particularly if we think they should have a label or they already have a label. So we want to make sure that we don't give them a label and then say, oh, that's because of that. We need to truly look at it. One of the ones that I see all the time is children who enter into your classroom without speaking a lot of English. So they've either recently migrated into Australia or they come from a home where English is not the language that is spoken until literally the child gets to school. So the parents both speak a different language and then they come to school. What I find is that we often say, oh, that's because they haven't had a lot of English. What we know is that in 6 to 12 months immersed in an English-speaking classroom, children who are developing appropriately and within a standard range, they will develop well and truly enough English to communicate effectively. Children who don't develop English within that 6 to 12 months, we need to investigate other things. So we can't have a stereotype, oh, they're an EALD child, English as a second language, therefore that's why they're not doing that. We need to really get to the bottom of it and not just have a stereotype. So we need to make sure that we're very objective in the two areas of how we collect the information and how we record the information. So we make sure that we are being very matter of fact, and that we then include a column for analysis. Our observation is written and our analysis is separate to the observation. The observation is what we see at the point in time. The analysis is where we add the other information that we may know as well. When it comes to confidentiality, it's about an individual's right to decide when and how those behaviours are going to be shared with others. So it means that we don't just go and talk to other people about a child. We don't go and talk to other parents ever about a child in our class. If a parent is on duty in the classroom with you and they say, oh gosh, so-and-so doesn't do so well, do they? You don't turn around and go, no, they don't, do they? You can do that with your EA because you are both at the same level and employed by the school, and you can talk that way, but you're in a position of trust of all the children who are in your care, and every child and caregiver has a right to privacy. So even though another parent might be helping out in the classroom, they don't have the right to the information about any other child in their class. So you can speak freely to the parent about their own children, not about any other child. So you need to keep your records in a place where they're not accessible to other people. So one time in my kindy, I had a mother that whenever she was around, she would just look at everything on my desk. It didn't matter if I had it underneath something else and so on. She would just look at whatever was on my desk. So I learned to always in that year make sure that everything was kept in the storeroom where I could see if she went in the storeroom. There was no reason for her to be in the storeroom, so I could kind of keep an eye on that. Now, any serious assessments, such as if a child has had any psychological tests, they have had a report because of a particular special need that they've had, and so on, these need to be kept within the school office in some way. So you can keep a copy of it in your room if you need to, or in a digital form, but then it will need to be stored in the office. So you need to keep that in mind at all points in time. Make sure that your EAs are also aware of the need for confidentiality, that sometimes you just need a little reminder of everyone in your area that confidentiality is of vital importance, and we do not have the right to talk to anyone else about a particular child unless it is within our professional standards. And that is you as a teacher to an admin, you as a teacher to an EA because it's relevant, and you as a teacher to some other teachers depending on how it works. But we don't need to share everybody's dirty laundry. We don't need to tell them a whole lot of things that nobody else has a right to know. So always be aware that your observations and assessment records should be confidential and used where appropriate. Now let's think about how often do we assess? Now, when we're looking at assessment, what I find is that in the early years, it's not like we assess in weeks 3, 5, 7, 9 or anything like that during term. It's about a constant style of assessment. So sometimes the who decides comes down to the school. There might be particular points in time that the school says in year 1, every student, for example, in Catholic Ed now, next from 2024 onwards, is going to be required to do the maths assessment interview within the first few weeks of year 1, as well as the reading recovery observation survey. So both of those assessments will need to be done. We know that NAPLAN gets done at years 3 and 5 during primary school. We know that on-entry data happens at the beginning of pre-primary. So you want to make sure that you know what has to happen in the school, what are the school requirements, what are the system or state requirements, and then what are your requirements that you want to have. So I said that I would do oral reading at least once a term, and I like to do twice a term when I had year ones. So I would do beginning and middle of the term and beginning and middle of the term. Sometimes I would do the end of the term as well if I missed the middle of the term. And they often do have a change over the school holidays. Sometimes, unfortunately, it goes backwards, but that's just part of it. I would do maths assessments very regularly, and maths assessments would be quite different as well. When you are in childcare, your assessment and observations are literally done daily about things. So you want to think how and when you want to do your assessments when you're in a school-based setting, because that last dot point, building resilience in relation to performance of some sort. Understanding that, yep, we've got to do this and that's just what we have to do sometimes, because there are more requirements for standardized testing that is happening in every school from now on. It's been happening for about 10 years. We've got NAPLAN, obviously, but we also have other standardized tests that we want to have. So we've got our incidental assessments that we're doing, our observations, notes, collection of data through all our different activities. And then we do have some external assessments and other more higher stakes assessments. Now, let's delve into our observations a little bit more. I find observation is my most used one. So there's lots of factors that we need to consider when we're doing observations. It's not just looking at something. I always have a reason for my observations. So we want to think about formal observations rather than just anecdotals of things that happen. So this week we're looking at formal observations where we have made a decision to sit and observe something. And they are intentional. We are looking for particular things that we wish to see or not see in some way. So we want to think, how do we do that? And what are we recording? Why are we looking at it? How are we using it to track development? How do we then analyze it out to actually create authentic activities for the children? So with our observations, we want to try, if we are doing good observations, to not distract from the instruction. So we want to sit off to the side, we want to observe, and so on. We want our observations to be useful, so they should be something that will improve what we're doing in some way. We don't want it to create anxiety. So that's where you want to build that idea that you're often going to be sitting there with a clipboard or with your iPad or whatever is your way. You're going to be taking lots of photos, good and bad reasons. You don't want the kids to see you with writing implements next to them in the sandpit and for them to just sit there and look at you. You want to be able to just be part of it, where they will often notice that you're writing different things or that you're typing different things or you're taking lots of photos. Where possible, obviously, we should always respect the privacy and dignity of our students and not be interfering in what's going on. So we need to make sure that we have a balance of assessment guiding our planning and our teaching. We don't want to be assessing and not doing some good teaching and good interactions with the kids. So when we're thinking about our observations, have a purpose. So I am going to spend the next week looking at, in my pre-kindy class, do the children have a dominant hand? So I'm going to do lots of different activities during the next week that I have the children to look at if they have established any hand dominance yet. So I'm going to be putting things in front of them and asking them to pick something up. I'm going to be doing some pre-writing activities and getting them to hold different types of crayons and different things to make marks on a paper. I'm going to be doing some painting. So I'm going to look at if they grab it with their left or their right hand. So then I'm noting down who has started to establish hand dominance and who's still grabbing things with each hand and so on. So I'm not interrupting the behaviours. They're just activities that I'm creating and I'm going to just be observing. So we want to make sure that it's authentic in some way. So what are the steps that we do? First of all, we decide on what is our purpose. We select a location that we're going to put the children and we're going to then select how do we see them. We're going to select an appropriate time frame. So if I'm worried about outside time and a couple of children and how they're interacting in outside time, I'm going to go, right, I'm going to watch this for 20 minutes. And I think it's usually happening after lunch. So I'll pop myself off to the side and I'm going to watch how these two children are interacting when they play afterwards. I'm going to do this in a particular format. So I'm going to decide that I'm using a particular observation style of a running record. I'm going to write down something every time I see some interactions between these two children. I'm going to decide, like I said, about 20 minutes or so, and I'm going to decide what I'm observing. I'm just observing these two particular children that I'm a bit worried about the interactions. And I'm focusing on one part. If I was looking at general interaction, I might divide it into some way. I will devise a record sheet that suits the needs I have, and then I will go through and complete my observation. I'm going to make sure that I really am clear about why I'm doing this. Now, if we are doing observations and we involve anyone else, so say I am a bit worried and I go and speak to my pre-primary colleague and I'm like, I'm a little bit worried about so-and-so and how they're moving when we're on the outdoor play equipment. I'm a little bit worried about their motor planning abilities. Can you come and just sit with me for a little while? Let's have a little observation and so on. That type of thing doesn't need parent permission. I can speak to a colleague, I can get someone else in. However, if I have a school psychologist attached to the school, I can't just go and ask the school psychologist to come and observe the child. I will need to get somebody to seek permission from the parents. So I'll need to have a meeting with the parents. I'll need to explain why I would like to get another professional involved, and the parents have the right to say no. So I need to be really aware of when I need to seek permission. So I want to make sure that I'm always observing the child in a familiar setting, not in an unfamiliar setting. I don't want to be in a room alone with them. So I don't sit and go into a storeroom with the door shut. That breaks our code of conduct. And it puts you in a position where parents could get a bit cranky at you. And obviously, again, protect everyone's confidentiality. And I make sure that all my observations are written down objectively. I don't just file them away. Assessment should be used to inform what we do. So it should be used to make a plan of action. It should be used as a conversation with a professional colleague of some sort and to inform my future planning. So I plan ahead as to why I'm doing this. Usually when I'm doing intense observations about a child, it's because I have a concern. And that concern could be a concern about their development, either good or bad, or it could be a concern that I'm not really sure what the problem is, I've just got a concern. And so my observations are starting to isolate out, what do I think is the real problem? Is it a problem with their motor coordination? Is it a problem with their actual body movements? Is it a problem with their eyesight? What am I worried about? I'm trying to analyze it in some form. So what do I do if they indicate a problem with some typical development? Or what do I do if it shows that they haven't grasped a skill? Or what do I do if my observations show that everything is okay? So in my first one, if I'm like, ooh, they really are not developing with what I would consider typical development, then I would seek a second opinion and I would then do some intervention activities in class. I'd do more observations and then I would work out who and what I see next, whether I involve parents, whether I involve other colleagues and so on. I keep working on things so that I don't involve the parents at the beginning. I involve the parents when I have a good set of data. But not too long. I don't wait 12 months before I involve the parents at the end of the year. I go in and I'm very clear about when and why we're doing different things. Now, strengths and weaknesses of some observations. Just be really aware that when we're working with littlies, they don't have to read and write to be assessed. We just have to be aware of what we're assessing and how we do it. They can be minimally aware. They don't need to know what's going on. We shouldn't be changing the activities and the routines. they need to be assessed in a setting that is relevant, and it is the most direct and valid way to obtain some information. So it does require your attention as an educator though, and that last dot point there, we need to make sure that we are always being objective so that we are not relying on our preconceptions to colour what we believe. So, as an example, Lauren and Catherine are in the home corner pretending to cook. Matt goes in to join the girls and Lauren says, "Can't play here, we're busy." And Matt stands and looks and goes, "Oh, I could be the daddy and do the dishes." And Lauren looks at Catherine and says, "Oh, okay, you can play." So the notes and comments are the girls play together regularly, they tend to discourage others, but a really positive thing is Matt's learned how to enter the group and that the girls have let him enter the group. That could go in a completely different way with my observations. So I'm being really objective. I'm not saying that the girls are being mean or anything. I'm just saying that they tend to discourage others. Sometimes they're a bit rude and they do tend to discourage, but Matt has learnt how to enter the group. So they're my simple observations. Then we move on to our more formalised things. Now, with our observations, we may look and go, "Gosh, I'm a bit worried about these things." So what you have is there are a number of what we call screening tools. So if I'm worried about a child's hearing, if I'm worried about a child's eyesight, if I'm worried about a child's movement and development, there's a number of screening tools that we can look at, and we'll look at these a little bit in our tutorial this week. So the US has lots of extra ones as well, but we've got a number of them. So the difference between a screening tool versus my school-based assessment tool, screening identifies really broad issues and it's more attached to development. So learning and teaching, that's not assessed in a screening tool. A screening tool is looking at a particular narrow aspect. It's great to use screening tools as one layer along with your personal observations to guide your discussions and to focus a meeting with parents or caregivers. And it's really great when you do screening tools across all of the kindies or all of the pre-primaries and so on, because you can start to see some patterns, particularly if you're in a school that might have 3 or 4 or 5 kindy or pre-primary classes, you can see some patterns that are developing in the cohorts. Sometimes we can see that a cohort actually is really achieving poorly in certain areas and we can target particular activities. Now we have on-entry assessment, which is done in the year prior to our formal year of year 1. It's a diagnostic tool. It looks at literacy and numeracy, and it uses lots of hands-on materials. So it's done online, the recording part, but you have materials that the children are working with as well. So it's done in weeks 3 to 6 of term 1 in pre-primary, and this is from the WA website. So you're doing it one-on-one, and therefore it should be able to guide you for some of the activities that you'll be able to plan later in that pre-primary class, because it will show across your particular class and across the cohort in the school and do comparisons with all of the other pre-primaries in like learning in like schools, I think, as well as a average across the state in some way. So looking at it, each teacher conducts it one-on-one, and it identifies the children who possibly haven't gone through kindy, because remember that kindy is not compulsory, pre-primary is. So every child needs to come to pre-primary and you need to take attendance. We take attendance in kindy, but we can't enforce a child to attend kindy, but we can with pre-primary. So your child, you are sent as a parent a summary of the skills and understandings that your child demonstrated. And that always leads to some really interesting discussions with parents, because some of them are very interested in all of that sort of data. Okay, quick summary. We need all types of assessment. We need to think about assessment that is diagnostic, assessment that is formative, and assessment that is summative. Observations, particularly in our early years, they are a valid form of assessment. Don't let anyone tell you that your observations aren't valid. They are. You may then need to additionally add other types of assessments. You want to make sure you're very objective when you're doing your assessments. Please be aware of confidentiality, and there are set assessments in the early years, such as the on-entry data, and there are others that will be coming in over the next couple of years for pre-primaries and year ones. Year ones in the Catholic system, for example, now have a couple of other tests that they need to do. Our tutorial this week, we've got some videos that we are watching and we're going to do observations on them, and we're looking at how that would influence our planning. So we are going to look at how and what we do with domains, and we're looking at standardized testing in the early years. What are some pros and cons of it?